So foreign policy, right? She has some narrowly focused stuff, and then some sort of general principles. The narrow things start with ending abusive contracts, right? So, this is the classic, everyone's heard about it for decades. The military contractors who rip off the government by charging, thousands of dollars for a screw or a toilet seat or something like that. I think the most stark example of this recently is the company TransDigm, which we may have mentioned before on the podcast. But if you don't know, this is a hedge fund which basically did some research and bought up a whole bunch of little defense suppliers which had a monopoly on individual parts, right? So they borrowed a shit ton of money. They bought up all these little companies, some of them not so little, and then they just jacked up the price. And as a Zach Carter article about this, when the investigation originally comes from the Capital Forum, which is a kind of trade publication about corporate abuses, they had this devilishly tricky strategy to basically jack up their prices to the exact level at which they would trigger an automatic Pentagon audit and then just back it off a tiny bit, right? But the percentage increase was there's a recent Inspector General report on this, price increases of between, there was, 90% overpriced to like 4,000 and 300 and something percent. There was some little half-inch drive pin, whatever a drive pin is, that should cost like $42. They were selling for like $4,200. And so, right. So this is what's motivating Warren's thing. And so what she wants to do is to end the revolving door. So she would ban giant defense contractors from hiring senior DoD officials, that's Department of Defense, and general and flag officers for 4 years after they leave the department. It would also require contractors to identify the former DoD officials who work for them and what they're working on. Okay, that's pretty good. Ban DoD officials from owning contractor stock. Another classic conflict of interest thing. You don't want people involved in awarding these contracts to be benefiting themselves. Limit foreign government hiring of American national security officials. There's a booming trade in like Saudi Arabia and Israel and so on, hiring, former officials and such.
I hear Michael Flynn has a good line on that.
Yeah, right. Classic. I mean, there's the whole government is infested with this kind of corruption, but I think it's probably worst in the Defense Department because the amount of money is so big and there's so little oversight. And what you're producing is, it's not like some kind of thing that you're going to, it's not like a dam or something like that that's going to have like a real domestic constituency that's looking at it all the time. You're just, it's just soldiers, and the American government doesn't give a crap when soldiers get killed. Then there's some disclosure stuff. So all that I would say is pretty good, like the system we have is such a fucking disaster zone. And it's definitely high time that we roll back a lot of these, abuses. And also, as we'll get to later, cut spending. The defense budget is up to like $750 billion now. It's like almost as much as it was at the height of the Iraq War. And for what? Doing shit we shouldn't be doing. However, there's an ideological thing that you can see here in that what Warren doesn't consider, and what she doesn't consider is just nationalizing some of these firms. if the government keeps getting ripped off by these basically middlemen, these people who are doing contracts or buying companies that do contracts, why don't you just take the whole thing in-house? And you think, oh, that'll lead to just different kinds of corruption and so on. But it's not as weird as you might think. J.W. Mason has a great review of a book called The Economy During Wartime, which is about World War II, and how how production was organized during the wartime economy, which involved just incredible controls on everything. And there's an amusing anecdote, which I may have mentioned before in the podcast, but Wilson says, Mason quotes this amusing exchange between U.S. Steel Chairman Elbert Gary and Bernard Baruch, head of the First World War era War Industries Board. Unhappy with what the military was paying for steel, Baruch informed Gary that if prices didn't come down, the government would simply take the industry over. When an incredulous Gary asked how U.S. Steel could be managed without its top executives, Baruch replied, "Oh, we'll get a second lieutenant or somebody to run it." More threatening than taxes, red tape, or even militant unions was the implication of wartime planning that owners were unnecessary to production. So, a lot of people don't know this, but prior to World War II, lots of military production was carried out by government, agencies. Skipping a little bit in this review, quote, by the 1960s, the military was more dependent on private contractors not only than during the war, but arguably than at any previous point in its history. From the 19th century through the 1940s, half of Navy ships were built in government-owned shipyards by government employees. But less than 2 decades after the end of the Second World War, this capacity was entirely gone and all new warships were built by private contractors. Large public investments in other areas of military production that long predated the wars similarly passed into the hands of private owners. And this was an ideological project because if there's this big, state-run thing that you can point to that puts out pretty good stuff, then that's a threat to the capitalist hegemony over the rest of the economy. Because if you can build ships, well, then why can't you build transistors or pharmaceuticals or, anything else you might imagine. And so there was this concerted effort from conservatives after the war to get all that stuff off the government books. The government owned about a quarter of the whole country's industrial plant. And that was carried, that was either bought or built outright by massive state spending. And I think, for all of Warren's laudable emphasis on corruption in the defense contracting process, insofar as we need to have a military at all, which, that's a questionable point, but we'll bracket that for the time being. It seems to me that at least, let's say half, as it was before, half of it ought to be done by the government itself. Because, just look around.
No, I think that's a great point to tie defense strategy to the economy, not just in terms of the kind of anodyne, well, literally, if you don't spend so much money on things and you even to your point about the fact that there would be savings because we wouldn't be bilked by these private contractors, reducing the bloated defense budget, right? Everyone's concerned about the deficit or the debt or something. None of those things, really matter for what you're saying. Because what you're saying is over and above all of that is the way that taking back government control of these things could be a powerful power shift in a major market. and one that would, of course, probably have implications for when we would or wouldn't go to war, because so much of the money that is made because of the profit incentive is driving, I would assume, the kinds of policies that would bring about the wars that need more and more of that spending. So the same thing with kind of healthcare or any public goods. When you nationalize or when the government takes reins, it's not only more efficient, there's bargaining power and there's lower costs because there's not the exploitation and so forth, but there is this shift in the end to which that industry is oriented and more democratic control over how something as important as the violence we do to other countries and the vast amount of money that could be made at the expense of brown bodies, right? How that's conducted. So it's both, not just a bottom line thing for our debt, but it's both an economic, reclaiming of the demos as against the capitalists, as well as itself a policy that could shift the way that we choose when and how often to go to war, I would think.
Yeah.
So she's not doing that. She's not supporting something that radical, I guess.
Right. Yes. And I don't, again, I don't think this would solve the imperial problem at a stroke, but it is the case that you see in Northern Virginia and Southern Maryland, this vast complex of contractors, lobbyists, and so on, and that gives a strong you have a minority of people with tons and tons of money, deep connections to the state apparatus here, and they that's like the kind of lobbying group that's always really effective. A small handful of rich people who can really coordinate their activities very easily, and they can push these, just sociopathic wars to go blow up wedding parties in Yemen because, hey, there's another bomb for fucking Raytheon or Lockheed Martin or whoever. And I do think, again, wouldn't solve these things at a stroke, not by a long shot, but it would really undermine that nexus of just like horrifying violence.